Thank you all so much for being here. Today's topic is how do we revise our writing to get published while honoring our vision as authors? And as I said, this is something I do get asked about quite a bit because I'm so candid about my experiences in the publishing world. So I want to share a little bit about that with you all as a preface to our conversation. And before we get into some of the nitty gritty, I want to talk about grit and what it takes in order to stay the course as a writer, even amidst countless rejections. Because the truth is, publication, especially if you're going with the trade publications and you're going the traditional publishing route, is a numbers game. And so that means that you just have to keep sending your work out over and over and over ad infinitum. It sometimes feels like, in order to create the journey or the career path, if you will, of being a writer and sustaining that over the long term. So it really never ends. We have to keep sending our work out. And so I wanted to talk about what revision looks like as a part of that process. Okay, so in order to be a writer, you have to have grit. You can never, ever, ever give up. We are writers. That is what we're here to do. But we are going to get feedback from so many different sources. We're going to get rejection. We're going to be asked to revise. So as a case point, I wanted to share with you about my journey, which is that I started writing novels when I was 26. I had just had my daughter. She was a year old. And I knew that I wanted to write this novel. I'd had it in me, burning inside of me since I was 16 years old. And I had this story that I needed to tell, but it just never was the right time. My daughter is my second child. So, I was full on in the throes of motherhood. I had been earning my master's degree and I was adjuncting at the community colleges, several community colleges. I was exhausted. It was just, there was never the right time to start. And so here I am nursing my daughter, and I heard about this thing called NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and maybe tried and accomplished and won yourselves. Congratulations, if so. And if you haven't, I absolutely recommend trying it as a motivating force. So during NaNoWriMo, you are supposed to write whatever the number is. I think it's about 50,000. I was shooting for 60,000 words in 1 month. And so that meant however many, about 3,000 words per day. And I just decided I was going to do it. And in 30 days, I had completed the first draft of my novel, Jubilee. And, after that 30 days, I did 80,000 words. I mean, that's how much fire was in me, stored energy that I turned into the kinetic energy during NaNoWriMo. And, then I was like, okay, I have this draft. Now what? 80,000 words, about 300 pages, but it was the very first piece of sustained fiction that I had ever written. So I sent it to a fellow writer whom I had met through the Penn Rosenthal Emerging Voices Fellowship, Reina Grande, and I love her so much. I recommend her book. She has a wonderful trajectory of novels that have come out. And so I highly recommend Reina's work. I sent this to her and it came back just covered in red pen everywhere. And it felt like my entire manuscript was bleeding and like she had stabbed it. But she's, a sister in writing whom I trust and I respect. And even though I couldn't really fully absorb all of her feedback at the time, I read through it, sometimes sobbing, quite honestly. And then I put it away and I got back to work. And I remember that she had given me some feedback that, like I said, I just couldn't hear it. I disagreed with her. I was like, Reina, I love you. You're awesome. I love your books, but you're just wrong. You don't know what I'm trying to do. You don't know what this novel, what the heart of it is. And so then I went and I revised and I took some writing classes and I revised it over the course of about 6 months, sent it out through Poets and Writers. I found an agent and was accepted, and the agent agreed to work with me and revised it again And then she sent it out to all of the publishers. And I got some great feedback, some really heartwarming and encouraging responses, but ultimately it was rejected everywhere by pretty much all of the major publishers, many of the independent publishers, university presses. Like it was rejected. And so at this point, a lot of writers might think, well, it didn't work. It's time to give up. And I've often heard the advice, your first draft is just for you to learn, and you put it away in a drawer and you move on. So I was at the time already working on another novel, Trinity Site. And I had this idea that had come to me, and I wrote it over the course of 2 or 3 years. And all this time raising my children and finishing up an MFA. And I was really excited about Trinity Site. I sent it out to an editor friend of mine who used to work at one of the big trade publishers, and she loved it. She said, "This is fabulous. Oh my gosh, you need to send this out." So, at this point, I had a different agent. I sent it to her, and she was like, "This is incredible. I'm going to send this out." And I was like, "Okay, that's awesome." A totally different response than with Jubilee, but my agent said, "Do you have anything else?" And I said, "Yes, I do." Because all this time, I did not listen to the people who said, your first draft or, your first book is just practice and you put it away and forget about it forever. Because Jubilee was my heart. As I told you, this story had been burning within me since I was 16 years old. And so by now, 6 years have passed, but every single year I have come back several times to Jubilee and revised it again and revised it again. And so I've sent both of my novels, Trinity Site and Jubilee, to my agent, and she sold them with an option for the third, which I hadn't even written yet. And so, by this time it was like 7 or 8 years of nothing, all rejections. And then in one fell swoop, I now have 3 books sold because I never gave up. And so that's what I want to be the focus on our talk today. So this is kind of the guiding quote and what I'm calling, or the guiding idea, this quote from Rilke, and how I have lived my writing life, although I've often railed against it. And it's very difficult sometimes, but this has been kind of the idea. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not seek the answers which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. And so when I finally was going to publish Trinity Site, which came out in 2020, I was revising it in 2019, and I'm sorry, Jubilee. Let me go back a second. Trinity Site had just been published in 2019, and I was working on final revisions for Jubilee. And so I took my kids over to my mom's house and I said, "Mom, I have a deadline. I have to get this final chapter written. And I don't exactly know how it's going to go. And so I need some quiet in the house." And I sat down and I wrote it, and I was crying through writing it. And I was like, this is exactly what needs to happen. And I called my mom and told her what had happened. And I finally took Reina Grande's advice that I had railed against. It was like 8 long years. I hadn't been able to see it for 8 years. I was like, no, she's wrong. She's wrong. That's not what happens. And I called my mom and I told her what happened in Jubilee. And she said, "Isn't that what always happened?" And so for me, that gets at the heart of revision and how this Rilke quote applies, because in order to maintain my own vision as an author, I had to live the question, and it had to come to me through lived experience and through the experience of learning how to become a writer, learning how to revise, learning, how story structure works. I couldn't just take the advice and plop it in because it wasn't organic to me, right? But I took it and I put it somewhere in my heart, and eventually lived it. And so that's how one of my major pieces of advice is that not only do you never, ever, ever give up, but that you only take in that which makes you stronger, because you're going to get advice from every which way, right? You're going to send your work out and people are just going to give you their advice. And whether that is editors, publishers, teachers, mentors, fellow writing friends, and as well as just your friends who happen to want to read your book, and readers themselves, right, are going to give you reviews. And so you're going to get all kinds of feedback. And as a writer, you have to learn to take in that which makes you stronger and know how to put it inside of your heart in a way that it can be useful to you and it doesn't stop you. It doesn't impede your process. It doesn't quell your voice, but it just helps you, right? Eventually as a writer. So I want to give one more little case point, revise like a mother. So this is my daughter and me, and my daughter is 11 years old. And during the pandemic, we started writing a young adult book together. And we finished a book and we sent it out to our agent. And just like Jubilee sent it around, it did not get picked up. And so now we have a new agent. And upon reading it, she has suggested all of these changes, like major, major changes at the structural level, with the mythic framework, with the plot, just all kinds of changes. And so we're making them right now, and we're going to resend them to our agent, who's going to send them out to our publisher. And so I asked my daughter how she was okay making all of these changes. And I want to share with you some of the advice, right, that my daughter and I have come to when we're thinking about revisioning, as like the old saying of killing our darlings, right? And so just like there's been that advice that your first draft is just practice and you put it in a drawer, I do not subscribe to that. I think that if it's your heart, then you keep revising it until it's, no matter what, until it's finally time, until it's finally ready. You just keep polishing it and sending it out. And so with killing our darlings, I don't think that's true, right? Darlings is kind of like, they're so precious, right? And yeah, we can definitely get rid of what's too precious, in terms of like sweet or, there's nothing that can't be put through its paces, is what I'm trying to say. Like nothing is above being tested and making sure that it's strong and necessary. But in terms of killing our darlings, the way that I see it is, my daughter said, don't throw a tantrum. and she's 11, but like behind this, right, she was saying, even if you're going to be asked to let things go, that's okay, right? Letting go is a part of life and you don't have to cling to it. So that was part of that, don't get too attached. And so the way we saw it is that we lived through writing the first draft together and revising the first draft. We have that experience. That part of the book is never going to change. It's going to be there underneath the rest of the story because we write in layers, right? And so we get the first draft down on the tracks, we lay it down, and then we come and we build something over it. And I think of a story that I heard about the Mona Lisa, and that Leonardo da Vinci first painted a really thick layer of lead white paint underneath. And that was so that he knew that all of the layers that he put on top, because apparently he revised it again and again, meaning he went back to it and repainted it again and again over 16 years. And so what we see as the Mona Lisa, and part of why she is so alive to us and she follows us and it seems like she's so haunting, is that there's all of those layers. And he knew that the light was going to travel down and reflect better off of that lead white paint that was beneath the surface. And it was that reflection of light was going to cause the changes in the way that she's seen. And so that's how I think of revision and why we can not throw a tantrum and why we can not get so attached, because whatever we put of ourselves in that first draft is still going to be there, even when we revise it. And even anything that we take out is still, the haunting memory of it is still going to be there on the pages. And I know that sounds a little woo woo, and partly I'm just a little woo woo. But also, I love a Louise Glick quote. She's a poet that I just absolutely adore. And Louise Glick says that she loves poetry that has silence built into it, that has the effect of ruins, where it, as a reader, you know that there used to be a whole building there, a whole structure, but that part of it has eroded or been knocked down, been pulled out, been maybe even purposely taken away. And what you have left is the effect of ruins. And so in a similar way as the Mona Lisa, right, similar process, I think that the context, the words themselves, the story and its evolution are going to be affected and shaped by everything that came before. And so we don't have to see it as killing our darlings, because there was a necessary purpose for the process that took us to that step, and we can thank them and then move on. It's kind of like the Marie Kondo, right? you take a part of your novel or your poetry collection or your short story collection or your essay collection, whatever you're working on, you take the paragraph, you take the words, do they bring you joy? Do they bring the story, right? Are they necessary to the story? Do they bring the story something necessary? And if not, thank them and let them go. So for those of you who may have trouble, as I used to, letting things go, that's one way that you can think of it. And then knowing what to fight for and how to fight for it. So as I said, I never let Jubilee go. I absolutely refused. And so I went back, I changed it into close first person. And then I changed it back to third person. And then, I did major structural changes. And every single time I would send it back out and, did it get picked up or not? And so, or, I would send it to an agent or I would send it to an editor for feedback. And it's like just testing it, but I didn't change the heart. And that's where don't give up on your beloveds, right? Sticking to the heart truth, the central theme or the central idea that brought you to it in the first place, and that is solid as a rock, right? And so you might need to learn your craft in order to make that rock shine, but that it's solid at its core. Don't let that go. And so for me, part of how I retain the tenacity to go forward as a writer and to send my work out there again and again after countless publications is keeping this core of why I must write and why I want to publish, and finding out what is there in the center, right, of this Venn diagram. And that's what I hang on to. So part of why I must write is that I know that I have gone through experiences and I have learned wisdom, right? I have wisdom to share that is useful to people. People have come to me, they have told me that my poems, my stories have meant something to them. They have found resonance in them, they could relate to them. They hadn't ever seen, for instance, Latinas who grew up on the border, the Mexicali border, which is the Mexican border in the Southwestern desert. They had never seen that reflected in the way that I write about it. And they were grateful to me for that. Or they hadn't ever seen motherhood described in the way that I describe it, or how vulnerable I am talking about mothering through mental illness or chronic illness, right? And so I'm speaking truths that people need to hear. And I know that about myself. So why I want to publish is that, right, I know that it's important to get these out. That's my core. I have a whole bunch of other reasons I like to write and that I must write. It's also therapeutic to me in many ways. I'm good at it. I just love doing it, right? But what does that have to do with publishing that's going to keep me resilient and keep me going? What's the center of the Venn diagram there? So for me, it's that I know I have something to say worth telling. And we all do. And so what I think that we need to do as writers in order to stay resilient, stay tenacious, and develop that sense of grit where we do not give up are the 3 R's. So my reason is, this is your, how do you say it in French? Raison d'être? I don't even know how to say it, but your reason, right? Why? Why do you need to write? So I want you to fill that in for yourself. Your readers are. So who are your readers? And as I said, I know for me, lots of people read my books, but I know that I am writing specifically for women and girls who have gone through trauma, whose voices have not traditionally been uplifted and heard. And so I'm writing for myself as a young girl. I'm writing for myself as a teenager and a young woman. I'm writing for my daughter. Okay. And so those are my readers. And that's why it's so important to me. And then I am resilient because, and for me, as you probably guessed already based on my talk so far, I'm resilient because I am a mother, right? And so I'm writing as a mother and as a daughter. I'm writing to mother myself, mother other people, mother the words onto the page. I'm a mother beep as well, meaning I'm a badass, right? I can do that. I have given birth. Like I have adopted my son. I know that I am strong. And so when, there are times that rejection gets to me. Absolutely. Right. I will cry for, a whole hour about a rejection sometimes. And my kids come in, what's wrong, mama? It's like somebody has died. That's how badly that particular rejection hit because I had gotten my heart set on it, and then I'll need to take a few days off and sometimes a few weeks off and just take a break and go outside and be in nature. I didn't write for several months earlier this year. And I was really just focused on, going into the dirt and at the beach. And I would just sit there in the sand and play with it. And there was such a relief for those hours that I was sitting at the beach to just build something. I was building sandcastles with my children to build something and know that the water was just going to come and wash it away. And I didn't have to revise it. And I didn't have to, polish it to the point that it could go out there and speak to as many people as it could. And so I think that, we are human and we need a break sometimes. So the other side of this really should be the 4 R's. Actually, let me add a 4th R while I'm thinking this through with you all. The 4th R is rest. And I think that really is integral. And I'm going to go and change my slideshow after this. So we need to rest so that we can come back. And I'm now, as I said, full on revising my young adult book with my daughter. And I'm getting ready to launch back into my 4th novel for adults. So I want you to just take a quick moment right now to think about what is the beating heart of your story that you're working on, or your poems, or your poetry collection. And you might not have an answer right now, but just write this sentence down for yourself somewhere so that you can think about it in the future. Because this is what, for myself, I have clung to and what has caused me to be as resilient as I am, because I have been rejected at least, and I'm not kidding, get ready for this, 1,000 times, because I write all the time and I send out all the time, except when I'm resting. And so in order to have published, I think it's about 300 individual poems and stories in different journals at this point, as well as 11 books of full-length poetry, chapbooks, novels, and a book of craft in 11 years, because I started fully, seriously sending work out. Oh, I'm sorry, actually 14 years. I started sending work out when my son was a year old. So 14 years to have done that much. My own track record is about a 20% acceptance rate. So to have that many publications, I've been rejected over 1,000 times. So how do I keep showing up every single day that I write and send to the page? Is that I hold tightly to the beating heart. And for me, that personally is to mother. It's to heal generational trauma. It's to heal daughters and mothers. Okay. And so that I know that about myself. I have that heart beating, steadfast within me, and it gives me the resilience to keep going to the page. On a structural level, and talking about the nuts and bolts of craft, we want to get our structure in place. So we have that beating heart, and that is important. But what ends up happening often in revision is a buffing of the outside rather than going in and re-envisioning it. So when I said that we have to, stay true to our heart, that is true and that doesn't change. But like I said, also, we have to be confident enough in our beating heart and in our beloved. So whatever it is that we are writing for, and whatever that truth at the center, that hardcore in the center, we have to be willing to put it through the fire. We have to be willing at some times to burn the whole thing practically down to its essence and then start anew. And so this, I got this image from Darcy Pattison. So you can go online and look more into her process. But as a shorthand for mine, I wanted to share this with you, the levels of revision that that take place. And so there's the incremental revision, there's the quantum leap revision, and there's the line edit revision. And so what ends up happening a lot of times, and what I tried to do in the very beginning of Jubilee and why it didn't work, is that I was staying at the levels of the incremental revision, which is like making minor additions and deletions, increasing inner and outer conflict, moving scenes and chapters, increasing tension. So I was doing things like that, adding more epiphanies, improving verbs. Those are important craft techniques that we absolutely have to put our stories through. And, we really do need to put them through their paces and be tough on them. So they are important, but they're not necessarily enough. And at least not for every single project. For Trinity Site, it came out because I wrote slower. It took me about 3 years instead of 30 days, right? And so I didn't try to cram it all in. And so there were quantum leaps happening across those years. But what I'm trying to say here is that the incremental and the line edit, tightening up the text, cleaning up all of your prepositions or your all of your adverbs or something, getting rid of all of the adverbs, those are important. But it's the quantum leap revisions that are sometimes what is necessary. So this would be like breaking it into more than one book, adding or deleting a character, combining two characters into one, changing POV, switching genres, change of voice, switch age of reader, replot with major changes, and then expanding chapters and scenes. And I like to think of also with expanding as an accordion method, where you expand it as like much, much bigger than it really could ever possibly be, so that you're not leaving any idea out, and then you squeeze it back together like the accordion. And so this is quantum leap, and this is really going to take time and energy, and you have to trust in your story. Our story is wiser than we are. And every time I say story, I also mean poem, because I'm a poet at heart. You have to trust that your story or your poem is going to sustain it. And if it's not, right, then it wasn't the right one. It wasn't like you haven't found the true beating heart yet. And so keep digging deeper. And so if you need help digging deeper, I have that talk that I did with Authors Publish on Stranger Things and going into the subconscious and the underbelly. And I have some tactics for doing that and digging deeper. And that's available from Authors Publish website as well. But yeah, you absolutely have to keep putting your work through its paces. I love a Robert Frost quote that says that a poem is like a piece of ice on a hot stove, and it must ride its own melting. And I think of that as a story too, that it's going to just ride its own melting. And no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. And so I'm all for plotters. I'm a sort of a plotter pantser myself, in terms of how much do I plan, how much do I fly by the seat of my pants. I'm somewhere in the happy middle. But I think that we need to allow those quantum leap revision possibilities, where we really step back and say, okay, I've made something and it works, bravo, because most Americans want, and we're not all just in America, so I would say most people, right, want to write a novel, and only a small percentage ever actually do. So or a poetry collection. So for those of you who have, brava, but you've made something, but can you make something, right, even more beautiful, even more resonant, even more emotionally powerful? So that's something that I think is really important for us. Another thing that I want us to think about in terms of revision and how do we retain our own voice is that the voice that we use in the writing is queen. And yeah, this could be king or queen, whichever resonates most with you. For me, that's queen. But voice is what brings the readers in. It's what grabs them by the throat and won't let them go. It's when someone is speaking and we can't not listen, we lean in. So voice to me is attached to the beating heart of the poem or the story. So if you know what the beating heart is, then I think you might want to keep playing with a voice and asking people, and this is related to point of view, but it could come in third person, it could come in omniscient, it could come in first person. But the voice is when you start to speak, people lean in and listen. And so I think that in terms of revision, it is really key to get the voice right. And if that's already happening and people are telling you, I was really grabbed by such, I couldn't stop reading when I first went in, but then, right? So you have structural problems, right? But your voice is there and don't let that go. But then if you have people saying, I couldn't really get into it, then you need to work on voice, because voice is at the very forefront of your poetry collection and your novel. It should be there in the first poem. It should be there on the first, I was going to say the first page, but really the first paragraph, the first sentence, right, needs to grab the reader and not let go. So to reiterate, if your voice is already there, hang on to that. Okay. And that for my work, that's usually the case. I have voice, but I need to work on all kinds of other structural issues. Okay. But if people tell you that, they're not necessarily grabbed in the beginning, that's something that's going to be a major impediment. It's going to be difficult for you to find editors, to find agents and publishers, because people have such limited amount of time to read something new from the pile, from the slush pile, right, of hundreds or thousands of submissions that they're getting. And so they need to be hooked immediately. So I would ask a few trusted writer friends, a writing group that you're a part of, just, are they hooked immediately? That's important for us to know. So I wanted to mention it in the revision talk. The way that I see revision, as I'm sure you've already seen throughout the talk so far, is to re-envision, to see anew, and then to transform. And that's really what I'm hoping to convey to you today, is that idea of transformation. Never be afraid to see your writing as something, something different than it is in the current iteration, right? Because the heart. And I see it again, for me, all of my analogies go back to mothering. Here's actually, I don't know if it'll show it very well, but here's a picture of my son as a baby. And now he is 6'4". He's a 6'4", 200-pound giant. But his beating heart is the same. And, I mother him in different ways than I did when he was a baby, but the heart of our relationship and my love for him, my fierce advocacy for him, remains the same. And so that's how I think of, how we can revise and revise and revise and revise until, the world sees us and hears our message while retaining that beating heart. Let me give you just a few more revision tips. Read it as a reader and not a writer, and mark the places your mind drifts. If it bores you, it bores the reader. This is also attached to voice, but it's attached to, theme and story purpose, whether or not it's doing any story work. So if it's boring, it's boring. And then you can't fix that. So take it out. Another part of that is just giving it time. And I think that, a lot of us, if we have the courage and the motivation to submit it, then we have to do it right away, and we think the chances only coming one time, but that's not the case. So I would say get working immediately. If you have energy, get working on the next thing and give your current project, your work in progress, some time to cool off. And this is really something that took me many years to learn, because I had all these goals and I wanted to get my books published. And so I just had to get them out there into the world. And part of Jubilee's journey is probably that I just sent her out. I sent that novel out too soon. And so if I had held on to her a little bit, let her cool off, and then gone back, I would have seen all the boring parts quite easily and been able to take those out. Get that structure in place. We've talked about that a little bit. And I have other workshops that I do about structure. So we can talk, that's not really in the parameters of this talk, but getting that either story structure in place or poem structure in place is really, really important. Embracing the mark, just take notes, quantum leaps happen here. So go through it, read it, take little notes on the margins, keep a journal. I have several journals going for every draft that I'm working on, and revision is a process. And so you lay down the story on the tracks or the poem on the tracks, but you're revising in layers. And so I'm often thinking about the poems and the stories and writing notes to myself all throughout. And then I go back and revise them several times with those notes that I'm keeping. And I don't exactly know, I have no idea right now how certain aspects of the middle grade book that I'm writing with my daughter are going to happen. We're keeping notes and we have kind of an idea, but we're going to also let it write its own melting. And that's okay, because I trust the process. I trust us as writers, and I know that we will make it work. And so I'm not going to fret about the fact that not every single scene is jiving perfectly. That's okay, right? I just make a note that I need to come back to it and keep going. And so that's a part of the revision process as well. Just like with that Rilke quote, keep writing, and you will live the answers. By the time you get to the end, you're going to find that you probably know how to solve that problem in the middle. So just don't forget to go back and solve it. Find trusted readers. Sometimes you'll throw out their comments. Sometimes you'll take them to heart. You'll almost always have to decode their comments, right? And take the part of it that supports you. And so a lot of times what I'll do too is when I get feedback from editors that can be kind of painful. I learned this from my friend Lauren Fleming, who is also a writing teacher, and you want to look her up. She's wonderful. And I would send her, look what this editor said. And she would only take the best parts of what they said, so that it ended up sounding like they were giving me the best compliment in the whole world. And then I would put that somewhere that I could see it. And, and I do that now too, sometimes with full quotes, and there will be a reader that gave me kind of a mean review, but they also said something nice, and I hang on to that and I throw out the rest. Or they gave me some advice that, oh, it's a little painful, but they're right. So recently, one of the agents that we had tried for our middle grade book had said that we were giving too much information. There was too much information telling. And we thought, well, our protagonist knows a lot. She's a really smart girl, and so at first I was like, they're wrong, just like to Reina Grande, they're wrong, and then I thought about it and we went through the book and I was like, oh yeah, she's telling a little bit too much. She does know a lot, but not everything she knows is relevant to the scene. Not everything she knows is relevant to the plot, right? And so she can still come across as really smart, as really sassy, but she doesn't have to tell everything she knows, just what is most pertinent to the moment, okay? And so that's how you decode a comment, where at first it might rub you the wrong way, but just kind of let it sit there, and, and you'll know over time whether it's truly applicable to your book or not. Just don't be afraid to listen, even to those sometimes prickly comments that, feel a little uncomfortable at first. And then not until the writing has found its heart and it's beating clearly do you begin the polishing. At that point, edit away. Okay, so you're going to waste your time if you're worried about making it a really pretty draft on the outside if the inside is not working properly. Then you're going to have a really pretty machine that you turn it on and it just it doesn't do anything. So work on the inside first. Inside out, I think, is the method. We can't control luck, You're gonna get rejected. That's just part of the writing process. But the way that you succeed over time is to keep betting on yourself, keep writing, keep revising, keep sending it out, taking only that back into you, which makes you stronger, right? And then repeat the process again and again. It's a numbers game. You have to give yourself you have to play to win as many times as you can. So just keep sending your work out. And I think I have 2 more slides. So this is what it boils down to for me. Write your truths, hone your craft, and don't give up. If you have something to say it, right? That's the beating heart. Don't ever let anyone take that voice away from you. So, everyone's going to have a comment, everyone, but it's going to be an autobiography. That's another thing I've learned. All reviews, all feedback, it's an autobiography that reflects on the person. If you know who you are, right, then you don't let any of that harm come into you. You just keep speaking your truth. But then you also hone your craft, right? Because what's happening is they're not necessarily understanding your truth yet. They haven't seen it yet. They haven't heard it. Why? Because there are problems in the craft, and that's real. So you have to keep, taking the workshops, listening to trusted mentors, reading books you love, books that bring you joy, that make you laugh, that make you cry, books that, you want to emulate. Keep reading as often as you can and writing all the time. And eventually over time, you will learn how to say exactly what you need to say in the way that you need to say it. And finally, don't ever, ever, ever give up, right? You have something to say that someone needs to hear. And so you have to say it. Don't give up. The true voyage of discovery is not in seeking new places, but in having new eyes. And so if you just keep going through the process and build this writing life for yourself, eventually you will find that you are the one who has transformed, and your books along with you. Most of what I have found for myself is that I craft poems and stories in similar ways. And I feel like a poem is boiled down to the essence of a scene, because both are about, ultimately for me, desire at the heart. Someone wants something, and what will they do to get it, or why can't they have it? And so that for me is how all writing is similar. And it's boiled down to a few lines versus a few paragraphs or a few pages, but the essence of it is the same. And so I still have to find that beating heart. And I look for the beating heart of the poem. Kim Adonisio has a wonderful book called Ordinary Genius that I highly recommend. And she talks about the beating heart of a poem as well in that book. And so I do follow the same process. And that accordion method, I do that with poems as well. And so what I'll often do is stretch them out, so it might have been originally a sonnet. I'll make it, 2 or 3 sonnets, and then go back through and bring the scalpel to it and make it one sonnet again. If you end up feeling stuck or kind of lukewarm about it and you're not sure what's going on, I would really ask yourself. So there's a set of questions that Helen Bendler has on how, as a reader, you can analyze a poem. Do this for myself. I'll take my poems through their paces by asking myself as the writer, right? So I'll come to it as a reader. And if I can't feel like I know what the major theme is as a reader, there really might not be one, and that's a problem. So theme and heart, I think, are comparable or go hand in hand. So my biggest recommendation there would be to join a writer's group, or to go onto social media, or look through places like Authors Publish, go to other workshops that offer free workshops, and find fellow writers and just start making those connections with them. So for instance, as a poet, I do binders on Facebook, where it's binders is for women and women identifying poets. And then I will say, hey, I have this new poetry collection. Would anyone like to trade with me? And so we might not have money to share, but we can still share our energy by offering to read other people's work as well. And so that is our payment. and we will do a trade. So I would recommend trading with writers that you trust, as well as finding beta readers who will just do it for free because they love to read. And so you can put out a call again on social media and asking your friends, depending on what the project is. But I've always found that when I just put out the call, hey, I have this new thing. Would anyone like to read it? And then I vet whoever responds to it, right? You have to be careful and make sure that you know them, you trust them, you've built a rapport with them, because you still want to make sure that you're sending it to people whom you can trust and that it's going to be useful. Their feedback will be useful to you in some way. But I would say trying things like that, as well as NaNoWriMo organization can also connect readers. So writers. So anywhere that you can go that will connect you to other writers, that's what you do. And that's how you find your people. And that's how you begin to build your network of writers who can share work with each other. And then over time, also, I would say save toward. So being a writer is important to you. And so we put our energy, we put our money toward things that are important to us. So save up over time and save, however much you can, and that's your budget. And then you do your research and find editors who can fit within your budget and let them know. That's the other thing. I will tell editors, I really would love to work with you, but I only have this budget of such and such. And, because a lot of times, because I'm a woman of color, for instance, they might have a fund for me, and so some people might have a fund or a scholarship program that will afford you those opportunities, as well as going on poetsandwriters.com and other places where you can search for opportunities for scholarships, fellowships. There are organizations that do give money to writers so that we can keep writing. And again, you have to be willing to put in the time and energy to apply to those things. One last caveat, I don't recommend paying to apply. Odds are low for all of us because there are so many writers who need support, who need help, right? They're getting thousands of applications. So do not spend money on contests or, that kind of thing, because then you're pretty much just throwing your money away, essentially. So follow me on social media if you have more questions about that, because I'm always happy to talk money in the poetry world and the writing world. I think we need to be much more transparent about it. I just always want to help writers because I'm always in a bind for money too. Like I said, my first agent I found through Poets and Writers. Actually, all of my agents I have found through Poets and Writers. So that's been my trusted source for finding about most of the opportunities that I personally have found, because they do some of the vetting for you. And so I've appreciated that. I just sent out query letters, and I sent out, I want to say a good 50 emails or so each time. And so I just built a really strong query letter, and I polished the first 20 or 30 pages, to make them, everything that we talked about in the lecture, voice, hook, all of it, like it was all shining, and sent it out. And that, that's really how I found my agent. The first agent just decided she wasn't going to be an agent anymore and was going back to school. So that's why I had to find another one. And then the current agent and I had some artistic differences, especially around young adult writing. And so we parted ways amicably. And I found another agent who has more experience selling both adult and children's fiction. And so we just have a partnership that's going to work for the new direction I'm going in. It's just, I need someone who understands what I'm doing and can have the time and energy and, emotional capacity. Like we get along, right? Just like you would with a friendship or dating. It's a lot like dating, and finding a partner, because this is someone who's going to be in your ring, who's going to fight for you. And it's not always 49 rejections. I mean, just because, well, I guess it is a rejection, and that sometimes you just don't hear back from them. But then I just tell myself, well, they don't have time. That's fine. They don't have time. My story's not for them. It's honestly, it is a lot, just like having good self-esteem, and knowing that if they don't respond, just like if you go on a date and they don't call you back, it's not, like it wouldn't have been a good partnership anyway. Why would you ever want to be with who doesn't see how amazing you are, right? I think that's about it. And then just that sometimes people will get back to you sooner. So some people just take a long, long time. I actually self-published my book of prompts. And that for me, I already had a readership that I knew was interested in the book. I had the platform ready-made. And so I knew that, I had something ready to go and I didn't need to go the route of finding a traditional publisher. So I published it myself through Amazon, KDP Publishing. And I found that was very effective for me for that particular book, which was Book of Craft. I don't have a ready built audience yet. I'm still building it for my adult fiction, so literary fiction. And then same thing with my middle grade. So my advice around this then is that go the self-publishing route if you already have a platform and you already know that there are people that, you have a newsletter or you have a niche or you're killing it on social media or your TikTok sensation or whatever. Like, by all means, hire an editor, make sure that it is the best work you can put out there and go the self-publishing route. But for many of us, in order to sell our books, we need people who are going to read them. And I found that the self-publishing route doesn't always work for people who don't have a publisher who will help them, who will work in tandem with you and fight for you and help maybe give you a marketing budget to get your work out there in front of readers, which is what we all want. We want people to read our work. So for me, that's what it came down to. And I think there's a lot more that goes into it. That's a great question. And I would just keep researching it. But for myself, it just came down to an audience. And that's why I continue to go the traditional route. My books are more literary. And on the other side, like Jessamine Ward, and so she's writing the kind of books that I want to write. And so if I were just self-publishing, which is great, it's fine, but it's not necessarily going to put me as a comp between those writers. So I would, if you love self-published writers and those are who you're emulating, and, by all means, find out how they're doing it and go that route, because it is totally legit, and a lot of times I think even the preferable path for some people, just not for those of us that are writing more literary works. One thing I do is I seek lots of feedback. So I will send it out to several readers. And if, everybody liked it, but one person hated it, then I will assume that it's mostly working, but I might need to tweak it just a little bit to make sure that it comes through. But ultimately, we can't please everyone. We are not everyone's cup of tea. And so that's why I will send it out several places, not just to the professional editor, but to several trusted friends as well. Because even editors have our blind spots. And so everybody has their own subjective experience. And so an editor might insist that something is wrong with it. But that, well, no, if you actually have a conversation with them and talk to them about why they hated it, you might find out, that their brother had, a similar issue and they've got a story to go with it. And that's fine. That's why we go to story. But it says nothing about the quality of your work. And so that's what I try to remember as well. So I would say if something is really nagging at you, get a second and third opinion. So I am all for language play. I am all for visual poetry. And I think people should experiment and, follow their art and follow their craft. But for me and the writing that I love to read, that I have time and energy and I will put, I will make space for in my life, it has to have something, emotionally resonant in some way. It has to mean something to me. And that's how I feel about my writing as well. So yeah, I absolutely have learned my craft. I read craft books for fun all the time and I teach craft. I mentor other writers all the time and I teach craft. It's important, but it's always in service to the beating heart. Right. And it doesn't have to be some highfalutin, it could just be it doesn't have to be some totally deep, trenchant thing, but it's some idea that has importance to you. It could be something that you're curious about, that you wonder about, that's fantastic to you, that's exciting to you. Or it could be, a tragedy. It could be grief. It could be trauma at the heart. It could be healing that you're going for, whatever it is. I always think dig deeper and find out what really is going on. I think even people who say that it's just about language, I think there's probably a beating heart there that they might not they might or might not be aware of. Why do we do what we do? There's a reason for it. So I think about it in terms of psychology and experience, and everything we do has a reason behind it. We are meaning-making creatures, right? We are cause and effect creatures. That's how our brains are wired, to the point that if disparate happenings out in the world, occur, our brain will make a meaning, because we need meaning. We need story that much. It's a part of our survival. So to me, I go to things that help me to survive, essentially, as a mom, as a human, and that those are the only kind of works that I personally have time and energy to create. One thing I love to do, just like at the language level, and see if things are even making sense anymore, reading it backwards, sentence by sentence, not word by word, but like you take a chunk of it. So breaking it up like that. And then the other thing is really just putting it away. I would say, tell yourself you are not going to look at it for a whole month. You're so close to it that you cannot see it any other way. Tell yourself even 2 months or something, and work on completely different projects, take a break, and then come back. You'll actually, I think, be surprised by how much of a difference it'll make. And again, just lived experience. That's how it was for me with Jubilee. I was revising Jubilee, as I said, 2 or 3 times a year, every single year, for a good 7 or 8 years, maybe even longer. Math is not my forte, but however many years, it was a big chunk of time. It wasn't until that very last revision, when I was up against a deadline and I was like, this is now going to print, right, that I finally saw what I couldn't see any of the other times. So I would say maybe even give yourself different contexts, because it was a context shift in my life that made me see the change that needed to happen on the page. So like, read it in a different location, read it, right? So we're creatures of habit. We tend to see things in familiar patterns unless we shake them up and force ourselves to see new patterns. So I would say just giving yourself a variety of times and spaces and places that you could be reading that chapter or those scenes in order to make yourself re-see them. I hope that helps. Thank you all so much. I am on social media, and I do have a website where you can contact me if you have more questions. I'm always happy to talk all things writing with writers. Just don't give up. Don't give up.